The first 2 minutes of any sea story are the important ones. They decide whether a listener stays for the rest of the hour. So here's the sound I opened with back then. An old radio room with green meter lights, the whale-low thrum of diesel, and the slow, deliberate tap of a telegraph key somewhere beyond the soundproofing. Then the tap changed. It hesitated, and for a sliver of a second, I thought it was a trek of tired ears. We were on exercise with NATO, a gray line of ships practicing the choreography of war in peacetime. Aircraft overhead, frigates in box patterns, and a handful of submarines playing cat and mouse in the North Atlantic. Our boat was there because reconnaissance and training married routine with risk. The Admiralty likes exercises because they give you permission to do dangerous things in daylight and call it practice. The sailors call them windows into how the world actually behaves when the rules are loosened. The exercise briefings are precise and bureaucratic, the sort of paper that reduces risk to checkboxes, comms plan, emission control policy, exercise messages, safety corridors. NATO communications procedures are strict by design. There are documented formats for how you structure messages, how you handle authentication, how you declare a station lost or recovered. These manuals exist so that in the middle of a chaotic exercise, men don't invent meaning out of static. See ACP 121 style comms procedure references for format and radio discipline. The Navy trains you to expect the expected. Ghosts live in the exceptions. We were on our assigned patrol grid when the radio room first flagged a carrier. It was Morse, slow, irregular, and not on any exercise frequency we were monitoring. The radio man, a careful man named Novak, squinted at the headphones and clicked his tongue. "This is not exercise traffic," he said. I'll never forget the way his fingers paused above the paper tape, like a man who's realized he's reading someone else's diary. If you don't know Morse in the same way you don't know the weight of a wrench until you pick one up, let me give you the key facts that mattered in my watch that night. Morse, radio telegraphy, lives on HF, shortwave bands. HF can travel far by bouncing off the ionosphere, a trick called skywave propagation. And under the right ionospheric conditions, a signal can hop thousands of miles and arrive where it was not expected. This is not magic, it is ionospheric physics. The ARRL and NIST resources explain the skywave phenomenon and how HF can carry signals long distances under varying solar and geophysical conditions. The sky is a mirror. Sometimes the mirror shows what we thought we had left behind. The message came in as a string of dots and dashes. There's an immediacy to written Morse that voice lacks. It was not a garbled, copy-pasted number station or a modern digital burst. It was plain old telegraphy, and worse, it was purposeful. Novak transcribed an old call sign prefix, an abbreviated timestamp, and 3 letters that made every old sailor in the room go very still. They were the letters used on the Navy's list of a vessel declared lost in 1962. I will not name the ship in this account because you asked for the title's context intact, a vessel declared lost in 1962. But for the record, and for the kind of listener who checks the margins, there is a historical record of dozens of losses that year. Lists of shipwrecks and maritime incidents for 1962 are kept and used by researchers and maritime agencies. See annual casualty returns and shipwreck lists for 1962. The tape read a dead name as if someone had lit a candle in the dark. We had procedure. On scene, we flagged the signal, tried to localize bearing with our direction finder, and cross-checked with exercise traffic. A legitimate incoming from a vessel in distress goes through a chain: identification, position, intent. The Navy's communications instructions, formalized in ACP documents, teach everything about headers, checksums, and the way to structure a message to avoid spoofing. When a signal arrives that looks like a valid header, but whose origin doesn't match any known transmitter. Radio men trained by the book get a sliver of vertigo. The tape in Novak's hands was short and, from a technical standpoint, innocuous. A string of old-style distress signals, then a 5-digit grid, then a call sign that matched the registry entry for that long-lost vessel. We ran it through the receiver's waterfall and looked for a lot of signals that would corroborate its origin. No VHF call, no HF header we recognized, no scheduled relay. It was like finding a footprint in dust and seeing the dust pattern was decades ago. Footprints don't tell you who's alive. They tell you someone was here. We tried everything sensible. Novak adjusted the receiver's antenna to get a bearing on the carrier. The ship had direction-finding gear, the sort of set that can narrow a skywave to a quadrant. But skywave paths are messy. Ionospheric refraction, multi-hop returns, and ducting can all bend a straight line into a pretzel. The ionosphere can act like a mirror and a lens at the same time. A transmitter that's thousands of kilometers away can appear as if it's much nearer, depending on conditions. General references on radio propagation and ionospheric effects explain these behaviors in detail.
The air can fold. Messages get misplaced inside the fold. We called the naval commsnet and logged the traffic. The SOP says you attempt authentication, call back on the agreed frequencies, request a code word, run the challenge response. But the command net was dry that night. Exercise limits and a scheduled EM-CON, emission control, meant we were not to reply without authorization. We also had a safety consideration. Unwanted transmissions can be a trap. In exercises and in real wars, adversaries sometimes send fake traffic to confuse or draw a ship into a position. The manuals exist to prevent that. ACP-121 and its kin cover challenge response and reporting. The rules exist because someone once mistook a hit for a trick. The captain was old salt quiet. He had a face you could read, like someone who'd seen the world file itself into shapes and then collapse. When Novak handed him the copy, he put on the headphones like it might be a relic, and then drew in the tape like a man resisting a confession. Listeners have heard ghost traffic before, he said. Numbers stations, long-delayed echoes, sea echoes. But this, he spit, and the tape hissed. We treat it as traffic. We do not treat it as myth. A quick aside for listeners who think ham radio mysteries are the same as naval procedure. There exist legendary ghost transmissions, echoes, and delayed transmissions called LDEs, delayed transmissions and ducting events, which, though poorly understood at times, have plausible geophysical explanations, temperature inversions, sporadic E, ducting layers, and other ionospheric quirks. Investigative pieces on radio ghosts and ionospheric ducting summarize these phenomena and, importantly, caution against immediate supernatural conclusions. The sea makes sound, the sky makes echoes. Both can lie. We did the cautious thing. We logged, observed, and attempted non-intrusive triangulation. Bearings came back as a set of arcs, not a point. The best we could do was to show the commander in our after-action the arcs and say, this doesn't localize to any active transmitter we can verify. In practical terms, a lot of weird HF talk is dismissed as propagation artifact, but there is a different category, very rare, of signals that seem to carry authenticated headers or content associated with ships long gone. Those are the ones that make men who are supposed to be rational feel like they've been interrupted. An authenticated ghost is a different breed of nightmare. There's a natural skepticism you are taught on boats. We were instructed not to feed the radio a name it didn't already know. If it calls a lost ship's call sign, do not assume the ship is the source. There are plausible modern explanations: a relay station playing back old logs, a recorder inadvertently rebroadcasting tape, or a malicious actor using old headers to sow confusion. But that night, two things stacked against easy explanations. First, the timing. The message arrived during a scheduled silent period and in a band where the receiving conditions were poor for contemporaneous rebroadcast. That reduces the chance of an accidental modern relay. Second, the content. The Morse used an archaic pro-sign and an abbreviated reporting style more common in older logs, tiny stylistic markers that a modern forger might miss. Old radio operators, the ones who cut their teeth on straight keys, have a tonal fingerprint in rhythm and spacing. Novak had learned that fingerprint from his grandfather's stories and from scratchy tapes. He listened like a man reading handwriting and said quietly, "This reads like the old clock." Handwriting lives longer than certification. I want to be clear and responsible. There is no verified, publicly documented case where a vessel long lost has actually transmitted in the present. The world has lists of ghost anecdotes and plenty of explainable events. But in my watch, we had something that looked like Morse, had a dead ship's call sign, and refused to be explained by the easy technical checks. That made the room quiet in a way that made men remember things they'd otherwise forget. We fed the traffic up the chain. Higher command is a slow animal in the fog. They want corroboration and they want paperwork. A plane was vectored to the area of the arcs to look for any floating wreckage or flotsam. Satellites checked surface reflectivity. The other units in the exercise were told to monitor and report any coordinated traffic. Bureaucracies love motion, and they do their best with it. Slow resources were put into motion. We were asked to stand by and continue monitoring. When the paper machine turns, it hums like a hive.
While we waited, men told stories. There's an economy of rumor on ships. It's a currency that buys sleep. The oldest sonar tech told a story about an old pal who'd once heard a faint hymn in Morse off a reef and later found an abandoned radio on the beach. Another told of the myth of a ship that kept sending the same coordinates until someone checked and found the coordinates were a cemetery. These stories are not data. They are how men try to shape meaning in a place that hates loose ends. Yet a single practical fact kept turning in my head. Morse is not an easy thing to fake well. The code has rhythm, the spacing between elements, dits and das, the intercharacter spacing, the cadence of a practiced operator, all create a signature. Radio amateurs and historians study these signatures. When a message arrives that feels like an old hand, your skin pricks. Rhythm is a human signature. Time passed. The vessel overhead circled the arcs, and the comms net buzzed in the way nets do. Muted concern, protocol, and an undercurrent of curiosity. We kept listening. Novak replayed the tape at slower speed, and we picked out a line that made us set down our mugs. The Morse spelled a short phrase in plain English, 3 words in an old distress formula that we recognized as a fragment that, when combined with the call sign, mirrored an excerpt from an archive log we had in the boat's small library. We cross-checked. The archive log recorded a final dash of a similar sequence at the date the vessel was declared lost, in 1962. Reading your own archive like a mirror is a slow, cold thing. I will say this plainly, as a mechanic who has spent nights with both his hands grease-black and his mind stubborn. The human mind will pattern-seek until it finds a pattern. But there is also an accounting of instruments and paperwork that must be respected. We did not invent that archive entry. The log existed in the naval historical files, and we used it to test the coincidence. The match was not perfect. We were not witnessing a verbatim playback, but it was close enough to hold the attention of those of us on watch. Higher command asked for calm and more logs. They also asked the other submarines in the box to attempt passive bearing fixes in their own direction-finding systems. 3 boats submitted arcs that converged in a sector, but not on a point. It's the sort of clustering that suggests a patch of sky where propagation favored a return, a duct,
and not necessarily a transmitter sitting at coordinates. This is plausibly consistent with a skywave reflection that funneled the signal to our box of ships. Technical primers on HF propagation and ducting explain these patterns. The sky has amplifiers that make echoes sound like people. When the surface aircraft reported back, there was nothing in the sector. No mast, no floating wreck, no visible signs of life. Satellites showed sea clutter, but nothing that concretely indicated a surface target on the water. The rescue coordinators started to talk with careful language. We must consider retransmission, misaddressed traffic, and spurious propagation before assuming contact with a lost unit. Their words were safety. Their silence, if you read it as sailors do, was restraint. Restraint is a kind of discipline. It keeps men alive if they can hold it. As the hours lengthened, the Morse returned in fits. Novak would play it, and sometimes the pattern would be shorter. Sometimes it would drift into numbers, and then back to that old call sign. We logged everything. We cross-checked with the historical registry. We circled the logbook with a pencil and put small notes in the margin. Possible relay? LDE? Check solar index? Solar indices do matter for HF propagation. The ionosphere's state can explain why signals that vanished long ago reappear at odd times. We called those natural explanations out loud because the rational mind wants a scaffold to stand on when the floor tilts. Science is the scaffold. Sometimes the scaffold creaks. When the day turned to night and the exercise wound down, the signal faded. It did not die with a flourish. It simply thinned and slipped away like someone ending a conversation politely. Still, it had left us with an itch. That night, upstairs in the wardroom, we scribbled the morning's events into a classified log, and then, like children playing at superstition, we copied a single line from the archival log into the margin of our watch notes. The dead ship's last recorded fragment. Someone taped a photocopy by the radio, and under it wrote, in a crude hand, "We copied you, but not the same." You hear a name come back from the past, and you find that the past remembers you too. We slept poorly. The ocean has a way of amplifying small concerns into long waking nights. The next morning, higher command instructed the box to maintain radio watch and to keep the temporary arcs active. We were told, politely and with the firmness of men who know how to close a subject, to treat the incident as an unusual but explainable propagation event unless further evidence demanded otherwise. That's how organizations default. If an evidence is not decisive, bureaucracies prefer the prosaic answer. But human minds do not always prefer prosaic answers. I kept replaying a line Novak had said after the tape. Sometimes old hands speak because no one is around to listen. Sometimes they speak because the sea thinks it's kind to talk. And sometimes something borrows the voice. Borrowed voices are the worst kind. They sound like home.
They told us to treat it as noise. Paper told us to treat it as propagation. The radio man's hands told us to treat it like a question that would not go away. Novak ran the tape again, and this time, the final 3 letters of the message, the lost ship's call sign, were followed by a single long dash, old style. The room held its breath like a diver waiting on the line. You learn to hear the sea hold its own breath, too. On a submarine, you do your best navigation with the tools you have. For HF radio direction finding, DF on HF, you can get bearing arcs from a single receiver if you have an array and you rotate it. Better yet, you get intersecting bearings from multiple platforms. Our box of NATO units, frigates, and a couple of Allied submarines began to feed arcs into the comms net. Each arc is a wedge, not a point. Skywave propagation makes those wedges wide because the ionosphere lifts and bends signals in strange ways. We ran bearings and plotted them on the chart table until the colored pencils looked like a child's sunburst. The convergence zone tightened to a patch of ocean that lay just off the exercise box. It was the kind of place you could drop a pin over and not feel certain anyone would notice. Arcs converge, but the sky makes them lie. I want to be clear about something technical because it mattered to the decisions that followed. HF skywave propagation is not a straight line. A transmitter thousands of miles away bounces between ionospheric layers and the ground in hops. Each hop changes the apparent bearing at the receiver. So when 3 ships give you 3 bearings, you're seeing 3 different folds of the same conversation across a bent sky. Experienced operators can sometimes recognize the pattern of a duct or sporadic E-hop and say, this looks like an X-hop signature, but it takes time and an experienced ear. We had ears. We also had time limits, the exercise plan, and the obligation to keep the fleet safe. We did what the procedure said. We logged, we broadcast a routine check on the designated net, asking for identification from the station using standard Allied communication procedures. We broadcast the authorized challenge and waited. The answer was the same slow, deliberate dots and dashes that had started the whole thing. No modern voice call, no teletype, just Morse. The challenge response is meant to spot spoofing by checking for the correct code word exchange. We had that option, but the exercise's EMCON rules forbade our broadcasting without higher authorization. That was a safety blanket until someone pulled at it. A rule that protects can become a cage when the thing you fear is quiet. We partitioned up the chain. The staff wanted corroboration that wasn't just ours. Aircraft were tasked. A maritime patrol plane cruised the convergent sector and came back with grainy images. A half-submerged object, a smear that might be a slick, an eddy with flotsam. Nothing conclusive. Satellite passes that day were poor. The clouds refused to be helpful. Fleet Command wanted a careful response. Monitor, don't commit. They were right in the bureaucratic sense. The captain was less patient in the human one. Bureaucracy buys time. The ocean buys certainties. After 9 hours of monitoring, the signal changed. It shifted from the same slow, archaic phrasing into a short numeric group, 5 digits, roughly a latitude-longitude fragment, and then stopped. Novak's tape showed no carrier drift, but the spacing of the characters carried a rhythm, likely a practiced transmitter. That 5-digit block intersected one of our arcs more tightly than anything had yet. It was a bad coordinate, in the sense that it lay over empty ocean on modern charts, but old charts and Lloyd's casualty returns show wreckage and derelicts move. Plate stamping is the only thing that lasts. We had to know whether an artifact or an object sat there. Coordinates in code are invitations. One of our Allied frigates, a unit with a small web of mine hunter gear and a stout ROV, volunteered to investigate physically. We gave them the best arcs and timestamps and a list of possible propagation quirks. They slipped a launch, set a grid, and sent the ROV down with cameras and a magnetometer. We watched the telemetry bubble up like a nervous heart. What the ROV sent back was the sort of thing you remember forever.
At 33 meters, the live feed resolved a shape, metal encrusted with barnacle and age, a tilted plate with opus rust and stamped letters. The ROV panned close and the feed sharpened. A serial plate, one line clear of corrosion, read like a scavenged relic, the registry that matched the lost ship's hull designation. The plate was small, a corner of the ship, but the characters matched the archival registry the Office of Maritime Losses had kept since the 60s. We stared at that screen until the room blurred. A name on steel is a sentence that the ocean can't edit out. This is the moment storytelling and investigation split. There are tidy ways to handle such a find. A physical object with a registry number is evidence. It can be cataloged, sampled, and recorded. It can be put in the chain of custody and shipped to port. But the ocean complicates neatness. The ROV operators found not only the stamped plate, but a length of frayed telegraph cable leading into a collapsed cavity in the wreck's superstructure. And then the feed froze as the camera caught something else, a small case, corroded but with glass intact, tethered in a way that suggested it had been secured intentionally. The feeds are poor often. The ROV feed was poor, and yet it captured that case like a photograph the ocean had been saving. Sometimes the sea protects its secrets in frames. The frigate's captain radioed up the find and recommended retrieval. Fleet Command authorized a controlled recovery. A diver team went down and brought the case up through a wet, coughing winch. We watched the canister sit on deck, dripping and moaning. The senior officer opened the case like someone opening an old book. Inside was a roll of film and a small rubber tube containing a paper, damp but legible. The film was curious because periscope and camera film from the era of the lost ship would have been of that celluloid type. The paper, once flattened and dried, showed handwritten Morse fragments and a hurried log entry dated 1962. The handwriting was a young, tight hand. The line we all read aloud under our breaths mirrored the sequence the morning's tape had relayed. A call sign, a truncated position, and the pro sign for distress. It felt like a last attempt to be heard. Paper lasts when people fall silent. That physical recovery shifted the conversation in the officers' wardroom. It forced the staff to treat the incident less like an ionospheric oddity and more like a salvage incident with legal outcomes. The law of wrecks exists because the sea does not respect borders. Lloyd's had its registry, navies had claims, descendants of the lost vessel had rights. For a moment, the affair lost its ghostly sheen and became procedural paperwork. But the procedure had thought teeth. When conservation officers and the legal liaison inspected the film, they found something odd. The frames, grainy black and white, showed a night scene, the lost ship's deck in 1962. Flashes, a funnel, men moving. Then, in the middle of the reel, a single frame of interference, a smear of light that resolved, when zoomed, into a tiny instrument mounted on the wreck's davit. It looked like a transmitter or a recording device, a crude logger more modern than the 1962 frame should have allowed. The analysts argued, contamination, later attachment, artifact. The debate took place in clipped sentences. Anachronisms dress old scenes in new clothes. Two parallel possibilities walked the wardroom like two different men. A, the present signal was explained by modern contamination. Someone tethered a recorder to the wreck years later, and it rebroadcast. B, the wreck had a last act that included a recording device, an old secret, or a failing relay that replayed its last log in some ionospheric mirror. The legal and technical teams preferred A by the book. It kept the world tidy. We were staring at an object on the water and a paper from 1962, so A was plausible. But we were sailors. We also watched the timing. The position found by the ROV matched the tighter arc from the morning's numeric group. The case's paper, once examined, included timestamps that, when you factored in drift and sea currents, aligned with the timing of the morning signal to the minute, a coincidence that made men uneasy and pushed discussion away from neat answers. Coincidences that are too precise smell like intention. There were more technical oddities. The ROV's magnetometer recorded stray, low-frequency magnetic pulses around the wreck at irregular intervals. The ship's magnetometers on the frigate saw micro-variations inconsistent with tectonic noise. Corby took the lab sample and ran spectral analysis on the recovered film's silver halide residue. The lab reported micro-trace chemicals consistent with prolonged seawater exposure, but also with a handling pattern that suggested the case had been sealed, opened briefly, then resealed. In plainer language, someone put the film in the case, sealed it, and maybe someone else had opened it decades later. Or the sea did a quiet, spectacular thing we did not understand. Salt can tell a story if you know where to read it.
In the wardroom, the captain moved like someone trying to keep a lid on a kettle. He told the men, in the tone officers use to keep the rumor mill from catching fire. Catalog it, log it, put it in the chain, notify salvage, notify archives, no public comment. That phrasing is precise. It gives the press zero to chew on and gives bureaucrats time to make the story harmless. But stories are not always content to be made harmless. The press has a nose for the smell of salt and mystery. Someone in a tender unit leaked a private note about a recovered reel. The next morning, an off-duty journalist asked the port office if anyone had seen news from the box. Fleet Command, now allergic to leaks, moved fast. They declared the recovered items the property of the state and requested immediate transfer to a shore lab. We handed over the objects, chain of custody, signatures, receipts. The film and paper vanished into a bureaucratic margin that readers call classified. Once a thing is labeled sensitive, men begin to look for smaller things that matter more. The formal explanation that the public received was methodical and careful. Wreckage matching registry confirmed. Recovered artifacts will be examined. Initial radio anomaly attributable to ionospheric propagation and retransmission artifacts during unusual solar conditions. No evidence of recent activity found. That's the sort of sentence that makes people in suits sleep. To those of us who had been in the room when the ROV panned the nameplate, those sentences felt like a clean sheet applied over a water stain. But two things kept me awake that night. First, Novak's ear. He was an old operator who could hear whether a hand played a telegraph key with the steady, impatient rhythm of youth or the long, careful spacing of a practiced shore operator. He told me privately that last long dash, it was deliberate. It's the way someone says goodbye. He didn't mean sentimentality. He meant cadence. Operators can tell when a hand has learned the music of a machine, and Novak had heard that tune. His certainty made the entire haul of cockroaches in my guts stand on end. Second, the canister's paper. Historians who examined the dried note found ink composition consistent with 1960s ballpoint ink, nothing modern. The handwriting analysis said the script matched logs from the ship's junior radio operator, archived in the Naval History Room. If a message copied from 1962 and carried forward had been replayed by a modern device, who had attached such a device and why? If the wreck itself had a last recorded log that somehow replayed, who had engineered that? The legal answer was slow. The human answer, the one sailors trade in whispers, was simpler and crueler. Sometimes the sea keeps a replay for reasons the land doesn't get to know. Sometimes evidence has a shadow behind it, and the shadow is the part you never sign. I'll give you the balanced technical reading because that's what any honest report must do. Plausible technical explanations. HF skywave propagation and ducting
can allow recorded signals, even old ones, to circulate and return. Tape echoes and long-delayed echoes, or LDEs, have been observed and discussed in technical literature. Experiments documented by NASA and radio science folks show delayed returns are real phenomena, though their mechanisms remain debated. A later relay, a modern transmitter rebroadcasting archived tapes, could explain a contemporaneous Morse with an old call sign. An organism or geophysical event producing periodic signals could be misread as telemetry. All of these are technically plausible and must be checked first. The less tidy reading, a relic in the water that still carried its last voice, a recording buoy, or a deliberate rebroadcast, a device that answered like a ghost. The sea gives you a thing to hold, and then it gives you reasons not to trust the hand that put it there. The plausible and the awful often live in the same room. Fleet intelligence convened aboard. They interviewed the ROV crew, the film analyst, the tender's pilots, and the men who handled the recovered artifacts. They vetted the chain of custody. Their report concluded partially in one tone and partially in another. Publicly, salt wash, technical phrases, no drama. Privately, a classified annex, unresolved telemetry with unusual spectral characteristics. Artifact recovery noted. Human factors analysis recommended. In short, a problem the Navy could describe in polite words as equipment anomaly, and in private call legacy interference.
The captain got a letter. He had to sign an acknowledgement that the event had entered the books and that he would not discuss raw findings. He signed. He walked past the mess, looking older. Men who had been in the radio room that day reported a wave of solicitous visits from men in suits, some offering quiet jobs ashore, others offering training transfers. People move differently after a delicate salvage operation. Silence arrives with offers. For years after the exercise, the story lived like a rumor squirreled down inside my head. Occasionally, cryptic phrases would turn up in the declassified literature. A footnote about an anomalous HF broadcast coincident with salvage. Someone compiled a tidy technical appendix that suggested the morning's weather conditions, a sporadic E-layer event, would have been ideal for long hops and for ducting of old transmissions. The papers I read later were sober. They documented a physics that is fascinating and unromantic. But physics explains a lot without comforting you. Facts explain, but they do not unmake the image. There were human costs. Novak, the man whose ear had first said, "This reads like an old clock," got moved into a comms training role in a far port where the nights were blazing with light and not conducive to long listening. Whether they reassigned him for his expertise or to get him out of a place that heard too many ghosts, I do not know. The tender's ice pilot took a longer posting and later retired. The frigate's ROV team were offered extra pay and a quiet commendation, and then they reported being followed by men who wanted to see their footage. People found reasons to leave the story behind. That's how institutions tidy uncomfortable corners. People are shuffled away like pawns when the board gets too public. In private, among the men who had been on watch that winter, we told the story differently. We kept the film in our memory. We kept Novak's cadence in our ears. We remembered the way the canister's paper smelled when it dried, salt and ink, and a smell like something old opened at dawn. We'd joke, too. The jokes are the part of a story that lets you live with it. But every so often, someone would go quiet at a bar and say, "You hear that tape sometimes. It's like someone really wanted to be found." And I'd feel something cold in the place of my sternum. A recovery that should have been proof became a question. The official record closed with the language institutions use to sleep at night. The classified annex remained classified. Technical teams wrote papers about ionospheric quirks that would later be read in university radio labs. Scholars who study LDEs published models and could explain the delays with partial mathematical beauty. The salvage office filed its receipts. The lost ship's descendants, a family somewhere in a coastal town, were notified that artifacts had been recovered. They received precise bureaucratic condolences and an invoice for beadwork. The human ledger showed small kindnesses, and the legal ledger showed the coldness of property. But the tape, that small, stubborn Morse that had first touched our ears, lived in my head like a bone under the skin. Sometimes, when static bleeds through a cheap radio at a bar far from the ocean, I hear the spacing of those old dots and dashes, and I think I understand why sailors tell stories. The sea keeps things. Sometimes it gives them back in frames. Sometimes frames come with the wrong light. If you want a tidy resolution, the Navy offered it. There is a technical explanation pending further research, and we will always prefer the technical explanation if it is plausible. If you want the messy human truth, I offer only what I remember. A lost name that called, a plate that still held letters, a canister that breathed open with the weight of 1962, and a tape that sounded like goodbye. The dead sometimes send postcards from the past, but the address is never simple.